Okay, continuing with the birth of Biopolitics, lectures by Michel Foucault at the College of France, 1978 through 79. Lecture number 4, given on the 31st of January, 1979. I am sure you have all heard of the art historian Berenson. He was almost 100 years old, approaching death, when he said something like, "God knows I fear the destruction of the world by the atomic bomb, but there is at least one thing I fear as much, and that is the invasion of humanity by the state." I think this is the purest, clearest expression of a state phobia, one of the most constant features of which is its coupling with fear of the atomic bomb. The state and the atomic bomb, or rather the bomb than the state, or the state is no better than the bomb, or the state entails the bomb, or the bomb entails and necessarily calls for the state. This familiar theme is not that recent, since Berenson expressed it around 1950 to 52. This state phobia runs through many contemporary themes and has undoubtedly been sustained by many sources for a long time. The Soviet experience of the 1920s, the German experience of Nazism, English post-war planning, and so on. The phobia has also had many agents and promoters, from economics professors inspired by Austrian neo-marginalism to political exiles who, from 1925, have certainly played a major role in the formation of political consciousness, and a role that perhaps has not been studied closely. An entire political history of exile could be written, or a history of political exile and its ideological, theoretical, and practical effects. Political exile at the end of the 19th century was certainly one of the major agents of the spread of socialism, and I think 20th century political exile or political dissidence has also been a significant agent of the spread of what could be called anti-statism or state phobia. To tell the truth, I do not want to talk about this state phobia directly and head on, because for me, it seems above all to be one of the signs of the crisis of governmentality I was talking about last week, of those crises of governmentality of the 16th century, which I spoke about last year, and of the second half of the 18th century, which manifests itself in that immense, difficult, and tangled criticism of despotism, tyranny, and arbitrariness. Well, just as at the end of the 18th century, there was a criticism of despotism and a phobia about despotism, an ambiguous phobia about despotism. So too today there is a phobia about the state, which is perhaps also ambiguous. Anyway, I would like to take up this problem of the state, or the question of the state, or state phobia, on the basis of the analysis of governmentality that I have already talked about. You will, of course, put to me the question, or make the objection. Once again, you do without a theory of the state. Well, I would reply, yes. I do. I want to. I must do without a theory of the state, as one can and must forego an indigestible meal. What does doing without a theory of the state mean? If you say that in my analysis I cancel the presence and the effect of state mechanisms, then I would reply, wrong. You are mistaken, or want to deceive yourself. For to tell the truth, I do exactly the opposite of this, whether in the case of madness or the constitution of that category, that quasi-natural object, mental illness, or of the organization of a clinical medicine, or of the integration of disciplinary mechanisms and technologies within the penal system. What was involved in each case was always the identification of the gradual, piecemeal, but continuous takeover by the state of a number of practices, ways of doing things, and, if you like, governmentalities. The problem of bringing under state control, of statification, is at the heart of the questions I have tried to address. However, if on the other hand, doing without a theory of the state means not starting off with an analysis of the nature, structure, and functions of the state in and for itself, if it means not starting from the state considered as a sort of political universe, and then, through successive extension, deducing the status of the mad, the sick, children, delinquents, and so on. In our kind of society, then I reply, yes, of course, I am determined to refrain from that kind of analysis. There is no question of deducing this set of practices from a supposed essence of the state in and for itself. We must refrain from this kind of analysis first of all because, quite simply, history is not a deductive science, and secondly, for another, no doubt more important and serious reason, the state does not have an essence. The state is not a universal nor in itself an autonomous source of power. The state is nothing but the effect, the profile, the mobile shape of a perpetual stratification, a perpetual stratification, or stratifications, in the sense of incessant transactions which modify or move or drastically change or insidiously shift sources of finance, modes of investment, decision-making centers, forms and types of control, relationships between local powers, the central authority, and so on. In short, the state has no heart, as we well know, but not just in the sense that it has no feelings, either good or bad, but it has no heart in the sense that it has no interior. The state is nothing else but the mobile effect of a regime of multiple governmentalities. That is why I propose to analyze, or rather to take up and test, this anxiety about the state, this state phobia, which seems to me a typical feature of the common themes today. Not by trying to wrest from the state the secret of what it is, like Marx tried to extract the secret of the commodity, but by moving outside and questioning the problem of the state, undertaking an investigation of the problem of the state on the basis of practices of governmentality. Having said that, in this perspective, and continuing with the analysis of liberal governmentality, I would like to see how it appears and reflects on itself. How at the same time it is brought into play and analyzes itself. How, in short, it currently programs itself. I have indicated some of what seem to me to be the, as it were, first characteristics of liberal governmentality as it appeared in the middle of the 18th century. So I will skip 2 centuries because, obviously, I do not claim to be able to undertake the overall, general, and continuous history of liberalism from the 18th to the 20th century, starting from how liberal governmentality is currently programming itself. I would just like to pick out and clarify some problems which recur from the 18th to the 20th century, more or less, and subject to the qualification that I may change the plan. Because, as you know, I am like the crawfish and advance sideways, I think. I hope we can study successively the problem of law and order. The opposition between the state and civil society. Or rather, the way in which this opposition functioned and was employed. And then, finally, if I am lucky, we will come to the problem of biopolitics and the problem of life. Law and order, the state and civil society, and politics of life. Law and order, the state and civil society, and politics of life. These are the three themes that I would like to pick out in this broad and lengthy history of 2 centuries of liberalism. So let's take things as they stand now. What is the nature of today's liberal, as one says, neoliberal program? You know that it is identified in 2 main forms, with different cornerstones and historical contexts. The German form is linked to the Weimar Republic, the crisis of 1929, the development of Nazism, the critique of Nazism, and finally post-war reconstruction. The other, American form, is a neoliberalism defined by reference to the New Deal, the criticism of Roosevelt's policies, and which especially after the war is developed and organized against federal interventionism, and then against the aid and other programs of the mainly Democratic administrations of Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, etc. There are, of course, a number of connections between these 2 forms of neoliberalism, which I have cut out with somewhat arbitrary slices. First of all, there is the main doctrinal adversary, Keynes, the common enemy, which ensures that criticism of Keynes will pass back and forth between these 2 neoliberalisms. Second, they share the same objects of repulsion, namely the state-controlled economy, planning, and state interventionism on precisely those overall quantities to which Keynes attached such theoretical and especially practical importance. Finally, a series of persons, theories, and books pass between these two forms of neoliberalism. The main ones referring to the Austrian school, broadly speaking, to Austrian neo-marginalism at any rate, to those who came from there, like von Mies, Hayek, and so on. I would like to talk all about the first, about, to put it very roughly, German neoliberalism, both because it seems to me to be more important theoretically than the others for the problem of governmentality. And also because I am not sure I will have enough time to talk about the Americans. So let's take the example of German neoliberalism. It's April 1948. Fine, I'm ashamed to remind you of things so well known, and throughout Europe, economic policies governed by a series of well-known requirements reign almost unchallenged. First, the requirement of reconstruction, that is to say, the conversion of a war economy back into a peace economy, the reconstruction of destroyed economic potential, and also the integration of new technological information, which appeared during the war, and new demographic and geopolitical facts. The second requirement is that of planning as the major instrument of reconstruction. Planning is required both due to internal necessities and also because of the weight represented by America and American policy and the existence of the Marshall Plan, which practically entailed, except precisely for Germany and Belgium, to which we will return shortly, the planning of each country and a degree of coordination between the different plans. Finally, the third requirement is constituted by social objectives that were considered to be politically indispensable in order to avoid the renewal of fascism and Nazism in Europe. In France, this requirement was formulated by the CNR. With these three requirements, reconstruction, planning, and broadly speaking, socialization and social objectives, all of which entailed an interventionist policy on the allocations of resources, price stability, the level of savings, the choice of investments, and a policy of full employment. We are in short, and once again, please forgive all these banalities, in the middle of a fully fledged Keynesian policy. Now, in April 1948, a scientific council formed alongside the German economic administration in what was called the Buy Zone. That is to say, the Anglo-American zone, presented a report which laid down the following principle. The Council is of the view that the function of the direction of the economic process should be assured as widely as possible by the price mechanism. It turned out that this resolution or principle was accepted unanimously, and the council voted by a simple majority for drawing and following consequence from this principle. We call for the immediate deregulation of prices in order to bring prices in line with world prices. So, broadly speaking, there is the principle of no price controls and the demand for immediate deregulation. We are in the realm of decisions, or of demands anyway, a realm of proposals that, in its elementary form, simplicity, calls to mind what the physiocrats called for, or what Turgot decided in 1774. This took place on 18 April 1948. 10 days later, on the 28th, at the meeting of the council at Frankfurt, Ludwig Erhard, who was not in charge of the scientific council, for it had to come together around him, but of the economic administration of the Anglo-American zone, or at any rate of the German part of the economic administration of the zone, gave a speech in which he took up the conclusions of this report. That is to say, he laid down the principle of no price controls and called for gradual deregulation. But he accompanied this principle and the conclusion he drew from it with a number of important considerations. He says, we must free the economy from state controls. We must avoid, he says, both anarchy and the termite state, because only a state that establishes both the freedom and responsibility of citizens can legitimately speak in the name of the people. You can see that This economic liberalism, this principle of respect for the market economy that was formulated by the Scientific Council, is inscribed within something much more general, and this is a principle according to which interventions by the state should generally be limited. The borders and limits of state control should be precisely fixed, and relations between individuals and the state determined. Ludwig Erhard's speech clearly differentiates these liberal choices, which he was about to propose to the Frankfurt meeting, from some other economic experiments that managed to be undertaken at this time, despite the dirigist, the interventionist, and Keynesian ambience in Europe. That is to say, a liberal policy was also adopted in Belgium, and partially too in Italy, where, spurred on by Luigi Einaudi, who was then the director of the Bank of Italy, a number of liberal measures were adopted. But in Belgium and Italy, these were specifically economic interventions. In Erhard's speech and in the choices he proposed, at that time, there was something quite different. What was at stake, and the text itself says this, was the legitimacy of the state. What does Ludwig Erhard mean when he says that we must free the economy from state controls while avoiding anarchy and the termite state? Because only a state that establishes both the freedom and responsibility of the citizens can legitimately speak in the name of the people. Actually, it is fairly ambiguous in the sense that I think it can and should be understood at two levels. On the one hand, a trivial level, if you like. It is simply a matter of saying that a state which abuses its power in the economic realm, and more generally in the realm of political life, violates basic rights, impairs essential freedoms, and thereby forfeits its own rights. A state cannot exercise its power legitimately if it violates the freedom of individuals. It forfeits its rights. The text does not say that it forfeits all its rights. It does not say, for example, that it is stripped of its rights of sovereignty. It says that it forfeits its rights of representativity. That is to say, a state which violates the basic freedoms violates the essential rights of citizens is no longer representative of the citizen. We can see what the precise tactical objective of this kind of statement is. In reality, it amounts to saying that the National Socialist state, which violated all these rights, could not be seen retrospectively as not having exercised its sovereignty legitimately. That is to say, roughly, that the orders, laws, and regulations imposed on German citizens are not invalidated, and as a result, the Germans cannot be held responsible for what was done in the legislative or regulatory framework of Nazism. However, on the other hand, it was and is retrospectively stripped of its rights of representativity. That is to say, what it did cannot be considered as having been done in the name of the German people. The whole extremely difficult problem of the legitimacy and legal status to be given to the measures taken under Nazism are present in this statement. But there is also a broader, more general, and at the same time more sophisticated meaning to Ludwig Erhard's statement that only a state that recognizes economic freedom and thus makes way for the freedom and responsibility of individuals can speak in the name of the people. Basically, Erhard is saying that in the current state of affairs, that is to say, in 1948, before the German state had been reconstituted, before the two German states had been constituted, it is clearly not possible to lay claim to historical rights for a not yet reconstituted Germany and for a still to be reconstituted German state, when these rights are debarred by history itself. It is not possible to claim juridical legitimacy, inasmuch as no apparatus, no consensus, and no collective will can manifest itself in a situation in which Germany is on the one hand divided and on the other occupied. So, there are no historical rights. There is no juridical legitimacy on which to found a new German state. But, and this is what Ludwig Erhard's text says implicitly, let's suppose an institutional framework whose nature or origin is not important. An institutional framework X. Let us suppose that the function of this institutional framework X is not, of course, to exercise sovereignty, since precisely there is nothing in the current situation that can found a juridical power of coercion, but is simply to guarantee freedom. So, its function is not to constrain, but simply to create a space of freedom, to guarantee a freedom, and precisely to guarantee it in the economic domain. Let us now suppose that in this institution X, whose function is not the sovereign exercise of the power to constrain, but simply to establish a space of freedom. Any number of individuals freely agreed to play this game of economic freedom, guaranteed by the institutional framework. What will happen? What would be implied by the free exercise of this freedom by individuals who are not constrained to exercise it, but who have simply been given the possibility of exercising it? Well, it would imply adherence to this framework. It would imply that consent has been given to any decision which may be taken to guarantee this economic freedom, or to secure that which makes this economic freedom possible. In other words, the institution of economic freedom will have to function, or at any rate will be able to function as a siphon, as it were, as a point of attraction for the formation of a political sovereignty. Of course, I am adding to Ludwig Erhard's apparent banal words a whole series of implicit meanings, which will only take on their value and effect later. I am adding a whole historical weight that is not yet present. But I will try to explain how and why this meaning, which is at once theoretical, political, and programmatic, really was in the minds of those who wrote this discourse, if not in the mind of the one who actually delivered it. I think this idea of a legitimizing foundation of the state on the guaranteed exercise of a economic freedom is important. Of course, we must take up this idea and its formulation in the precise context in which it appears. And straight away, it is easy to see tactical and strategic shrewdness. It was a matter of finding a juridical expedient in order to ask from an economic regime what could not be directly asked from constitutional law or from international law, or even quite simply from the political partners. Even more precisely, it was an artful move with regard to both the Americans and Europe, since by guaranteeing economic freedom to a Germany in the process of reconstruction and prior to any state apparatus, the Americans, and let's say different American lobbies, were assured that they could have the free relationships that they could choose with this German industry and economy. Secondly, both Western and Eastern Europe were reassured by ensuring that the institutional embryo being formed presented absolutely none of the dangers of the strong or totalitarian state they had experienced in the previous years. But beyond these immediate tactical imperatives, and beyond the immediate context and situation of 1948, I think there was the formulation in this discourse of something which will remain a fundamental feature of contemporary German governmentality. We should not think that economic activity in contemporary Germany, that is to say for 30 years, from 1948 until today, has been only one branch of the nation's activity. We should not think that good economic management has had no other effect and for no other foreseen and calculated end than that of securing the prosperity of all and each. In fact, in contemporary Germany, the economy, economic development, and economic growth produces sovereignty. It produces political sovereignty through the institution and institutional game that precisely makes this economy work. The economy produces legitimacy for the state that is its guarantor. In other words, the economy creates public law, and this is an absolutely important phenomenon, which is not entirely unique in history, to be sure, but is nonetheless a quite singular phenomenon in our times. In contemporary Germany, there is a circuit going constantly from the economic institution to the state. And if there is an inverse circuit going from the state to the economic institution, it should not be forgotten that the element that comes first in this kind of siphon is the economic institution. There is a permanent genesis, a permanent genealogy of the state from the economic institution. And even if this is not saying enough, for the economy does not only bring a juridical structure or legal legitimization to a German state that history had just debarred. This economic institution, the economic freedom that from the start, it is the role of this institution to guarantee and maintain, produces something even more real, concrete, and immediate than a legal legitimization. It produces a permanent consensus of all those who may appear as agents within the economic processes, as investors, workers, employers, and trade unions. All these economic partners produce a consensus, which is a political consensus, inasmuch as they accept this economic game of freedom. let's say that in leaving people free to act, the German neoliberal institution lets them speak. And to a large extent, it lets them act because it wants to let them speak. But what does it let them say? Well, it lets them say that one is right to give them freedom to act. That is to say, over and above juridical legitimation, adherence to this liberal system produces permanent consensus as a surplus product, and symmetrically to the genealogy of the state from the economic institution. The production of well-being by economic growth will produce a circuit going from the economic institution to the population's overall adherence to its regime and system. If we believe historians of the 16th century like Max Weber, it would seem that the enrichment of an individual in 16th century Protestant Germany was a sign of God's arbitrary election of that individual. What did wealth signify? Wealth was a sign that God really had granted his protection to that individual, and that he showed by this the certainty of a salvation which could not be guaranteed by anything in the individual's real and concrete works. You will not be saved because you have tried to enrich yourself as you should. But if in actual fact you have become rich, this is a sign sent to you on earth by God that you will be saved. So, enrichment enters into a system of signs in 16th century Germany. In 20th century Germany, an individual's enrichment will not be the arbitrary sign of his election by God. But general enrichment will be the sign of something else. Not, of course, of God's election, but the daily sign of the adherence of individuals to the state. So in 20th century Germany, again, an individual's enrichment will not be the arbitrary sign of his election by God, but general enrichment will be the sign of something else. Not, of course, of God's election, but the daily sign of the adherence of individuals to the state. In other words, the economy always signifies, but not at all in the sense that it endlessly produces those signs of the equivalence and exchange value of things, which in its illusory structure, or its structures of the simulacrum, has nothing to do with the use of things. The economy produces political signs that are enable the structures, mechanisms, and justifications of power to function. The free market, the economically free market, binds and manifests political bonds. A strong Dutch mark, a satisfactory rate of growth and expanding purchasing power, and a favorable balance of payments are, of course, the effects of good government in contemporary Germany. But to a certain extent, this is even more the way in which the founding consensus of a state, which history, defeat, or the decision of the victors had just outlawed, is constantly manifested and reinforced. The state rediscovers its law, its juridical law, and its real foundation in the existence and practice of economic freedom. History had said no to the German states. But now the economy will allow it to assert itself. Continuous economic growth will take over from a malfunctioning history. It will thus be possible to live and accept the breach of history as a breach in memory, inasmuch as a new dimension of temporality will be established in Germany that will no longer be a temporality of history, but one of economic growth. A reversal of the axis of time. Permission to forget. And economic growth are all, I think, at the very heart of the way in which the German economic political system functions. Economic freedom is jointly produced through growth, well-being, the state, and the forgetting of history. In contemporary Germany, we have what we can say is a radically economic state. Taking the word radically in the strict sense, that is to say, its root is precisely economic. As you know, Fichte, and this is generally all that is known about Fichte, spoke of a closed commercial state. I will have to come back to this a bit later. I will just say, making a somewhat artificial symmetry, that we have here the opposite of a closed commercial state. We have a state forming a commercial opening. In this first example in history of a radically economic state. Is this the first example in history of a radically economic state? We would have to ask historians who have a much better understanding of history than I do. Was Venice a radically economic state? Can we say that the United Provinces in the 16th century and still in the 17th century were in economic states? Anyway, we are dealing with something new in comparison with everything that since the 18th century constituted the functioning, justification, and programming of governmentality. If it is true that we are still dealing with a liberal type of governmentality, you can see the shift that has been carried out in relation to the liberalism programmed by the physiocrats, Turgot, and the economists of the 18th century, for whom the problem was exactly the opposite. The problem they had to resolve was the following. Given the existence of a legitimate state, which is already functioning in the fully and completely administrative form of a police state, how can we limit this existing state and, above all, allow for the necessary economic freedom within it? The problem the Germans had to resolve was the exact opposite. Given a state that does not exist, how can we get it to exist on the basis of this non-state space of economic freedom? I think this is the kind of commentary we can give on the apparently banal little sentence of the future Chancellor Erhard on 28th of April 1948. Once again, giving a lot of extra weight to this phrase, but extra weight which I will try to show is not arbitrary. Obviously, this idea, this formulation of 1948 could only take on this historical depth by being very quickly inscribed in a sequence of subsequent decisions and events. So, on 18 April, there is the report of the Scientific Council. On 28th April, Erhard's discourse. On 24th June 1948, abolition of price controls on industrial products, then of price controls on food, and then progressively but relatively slowly of all price controls. In 1952, price controls are abolished on coal and electricity, which is, I think, one of the last price controls to be abolished in Germany. And it is only in 1953 that there is a removal of exchange controls for foreign trade that reaches the level of around 80 to 95%. So in 1952-53, liberalization is more or less established. Another thing to note is that this policy of liberalization, more or less explicitly supported by the Americans for the reasons I mentioned, aroused considerable mistrust on the part of the other occupying powers, particularly the English, who were in a period of fully fledged Labor Party Keynesianism. It aroused considerable resistance in Germany itself, since, of course, prices began to rise as soon as the first price controls were abolished. The German socialists demanded Erhard's resignation in August 1948. And in November of the same year, there was a general strike against Erhard's economic policy and a call for a return to a state-controlled economy. The strike failed, and prices stabilized in December 1948. The third series of important facts for pinpointing the way in which the neoliberal program I have been talking about was inscribed in reality was a rallying of support for it on the part of a number of organizations and people. First of all, and very early on, there was support from the Christian Democrats, in spite of its stronger links with a Christian social economy than with a liberal type of economy. With the Christian Democrats came Christian theorists of the social economy, and in particular those of Munich. The famous Jesuit Oswald Nell Brüning, who taught political economy at Munich. The support of the labor unions was, of course, much more important. The first major, most official, and most manifest case of adherence to the program being that of Theodore Blank, who was vice president of the miners' union, and who declared that the liberal order constitutes a valid alternative to capitalism and economic planning. It could be said that this phrase is completely hypocritical or naively plays on a number of ambiguities. In fact, in saying that the liberal order constituted an alternative to capitalism and economic planning, you can see the asymmetries on which he was playing. Since the liberal order never claimed, or was certainly not claiming through the mouth of the future Chancellor Erhard, to be an alternative to capitalism, but was indeed a particular way of making capitalism work. And if it is true that he was opposed to planning, someone like Theodore Blank as a trade union representative on the one hand, and with his social Christian origins and ideology, etc., on the other, could not criticize it all that directly. And, in fact, what he meant was that in neoliberalism, there was the finally fulfilled promise of a middle way or third order between capitalism and socialism. Once again, this was not what was at stake at all. The phrase was simply intended to get the Christian-inspired trade unions of the time to swallow the pill. Finally, and above all, the SPD, social democracy, came over to the program. Although obviously it did so much more slowly than the others, since practically until 1950, German social democracy remained faithful to most of what had been its general principles of Marxist-inspired socialism since the end of the 19th century. At the Hanover Congress and again at the Bad Dürkheim Congress in 1949, the German Socialist Party still recognized the historical and political validity of the class struggle and had the socialization of the means of production as its objective. Fine, this is still how things stand in 1949 and in 1950. In 1955, Karl Schiller, who will later become Minister of the Economy and Finance in Federal Germany, writes a book that will cause a big stir since it bears the significant title, Socialism and Competition. That is to say, not socialism or competition, but socialism and competition. I don't know if he states it for the first time in this book, but anyway, he gives the greatest publicity to what will become the formula of German socialism. As much competition as possible and as much planning as necessary. This is in 1955. In 1959, at the Bad Godesberg Congress, German social democracy first renounced the principle of transition to the socialization of the means of production, and secondly and correlatively recognized that not only was private ownership of the means of production perfectly legitimate, but that it had a right to state protection and encouragement. That is to say, one of the state's essential and basic tasks is to protect not only private property in general, but private property in the means of production, with the condition, adds the motion of the Congress, of compatibility with an equitable social order. Finally, third, the Congress approved the principle of a market economy. Here again, with the restriction wherever the conditions of genuine competition prevail. Clearly, for anyone who thinks in Marxist terms, or on the basis of Marxism, or on the basis of the tradition of German socialism, what is important in these motions is obviously the series of renunciations, distortions, heresies, betrayals, as you like, of the class struggle, of the social appropriation of the means of production, and so on. From an orthodox Marxist perspective, it is these renunciations which are important, and all the rest, all these vague little restrictions like aiming for an equitable social order or realizing conditions of genuine competition, is just so much hypocrisy. But for someone who hears these same phrases with a different ear on the basis of a different theoretical background, these words, equitable social order, condition of genuine economic competition, resonate very differently, because they indicate, and here again is something that I would like to explain next week, adherence to a doctrinal and programmatic whole, which is not simply an economic theory on the effectiveness and utility of market freedom. It is adherence to a type of governmentality that was precisely the means by which the German economy served as the basis for the legitimate state. Why did German social democracy finally come over, albeit somewhat late, but fairly easily, to these practices, to these theses and programs of neoliberalism? There are at least two reasons. So why, again, why did German social democracy finally come over, albeit somewhat late, but fairly easily, to these theses, practices, and programs of neoliberalism? There are at least two reasons. One, of course, was a necessary and indispensable reason of political tactics. You can see that as long as the SPD, under the leadership of the old Schumacher, maintained the traditional attitude of a socialist party, on the one hand, accepting the system of the state, of the constitution and juridical structures of the so-called liberal Democrat regime, while on the other, rejecting in theory the principles of the capitalist economic system, thus adopting the task within this legal framework seen as sufficient for developing the basic role of essential freedoms, of simply correcting the existing system in terms of a number of distant objectives. It could have no place in the new economic political state that was being born. There could be no place for it, precisely because the new state was the opposite of this. It was not a matter of choosing or accepting a legal framework or a given historical framework, because it had been formed in that way by the state or by popular consensus, and then working within, economically, at a number of adjustments. It was quite the opposite. In the new German economic political regime, one started by giving oneself a certain economic functioning which was the very basis of the state and of its existence in international recognition. One gave oneself this economic framework, and it is then that the legitimacy of the state emerged, as it were. How could a socialist party, who at least long-term objective is a completely different economic regime, be integrated into this political game, since the givens had been reversed, so to speak? And it was the economic that was radical in relation to the state, and not the state that was primary as the historical juridical framework for this or that economic choice. Consequently, to enter into the political game of the new Germany, the SPD really had to convert to these neoliberal theses. If not to the economic, scientific, or theoretical theses, at least to the general practice of this neoliberalism as governmental practice. Thus, the famous Bad Godesberg Congress, with its absolute renunciation of the most traditional themes of social democracy, certainly was the break with Marxist theory, with Marxist socialism. But at the same time, it was, and this was not just a betrayal, except, if you like, in general historical terms, the acceptance of what was already in the process of functioning as the economic political consensus of German liberalism. It was not so much the renunciation of this or that part of the program common to most socialist parties as entry into the game of governmentality. There remains one more step for social democracy to make. And this was the break with the English model and any reference to Keynesian economics. This step was taken by Carl Schiller, him again in 1963. Since he even abandons the formula. As much competition as possible and as much planning as necessary. In 1963, he asserts the principle that all, even flexible planning, is dangerous for the liberal economy. At this point, social democracy has arrived. It has entered fully into the type of economic, political governmentality that was adopted by Germany in 1948. It joins in the game so well that 6 years later, Willy Brandt becomes Chancellor of Federal Germany. This is for sure one of the reasons, and not the least, but I think we should try to examine further this problem of the relation between German socialism and the neoliberal governmentality defined by Erhard in 1948. Or at least by his counselors, about whom I spoke a little last week. We can try to understand a bit better what happened and why it happened in this way. Actually, there is no doubt another reason than this kind of tactical stranglehold in which the German Socialist Party found itself after 1948. It is often said, well, at least by those who know his work, that there is no theory of power in Marx, that the theory of the state is inadequate in that it really is time to produce it. But is it really so important to provide oneself with a theory of the state? After all, the English have not done so badly, and at least until these last few years have been tolerably well governed without a theory of the state. At any rate, The last of the theories of the state is found in Hobbes. That is to say, in someone who was both the contemporary and supporter of a type of monarchy that the English precisely got rid of at that time. After Hobbes, there's Locke. Locke does not produce a theory of the state. He produces a theory of government. So we can say that the English political system has never functioned, and liberal doctrine has never functioned on the basis of, or even by providing itself with a theory of the state. They have adopted principles of government. In short, whether or not there is a theory of the state in Marx is for Marxists to decide. As for myself, I would say that what socialism lacks is not so much a theory of the state as a governmental reason. The definition of what a governmental rationality would be in socialism. That is to say, a reasonable and calculable measure of the extent, modes, and objectives of governmental action. Socialism provides itself with, or anyway proposes, an historical rationality. You know this, and there's no point saying anything more about it. It proposes an economic rationality. God knows how much discussion there has been about whether or not this rationality holds up, especially in the years from 1920 to 1930. Around this period, the neoliberals I have talked about, like von Mises, Hayek, and so on, especially von Mises, denied that there was an economic an economic rationality to socialism. Others replied to him, and we will come back to this. Let's say that the problem of the economic rationality of socialism is something about which we can argue. In any case, socialism offers an economic rationality just as it puts forward an historical rationality. We can also say that it possesses, and has shown that it possesses, rational techniques of intervention, of administrative intervention, in domains like those of health, social insurance, and so on. So it is possible to recognize the existence of an historical rationality, an economic rationality, and an administrative rationality in socialism, or at any rate, let's say that we can argue about the existence of these rationalities in socialism. And we cannot eliminate all these forms of rationality with the wave of the hand. But I do not think that there is an autonomous socialist governmentality. There is no governmental rationality of socialism. In actual fact, and history has shown this, socialism can only be implemented connected up to diverse types of governmentality. It has been connected up to liberal governmentality. And then socialism and its forms of rationality function as counterweights, as a corrective and a palliative to internal dangers. One can, moreover, reproach it, as do liberals, with being itself a danger. But it has lived, it has actually functioned, and we have examples of it within and connected up to liberal governmentalities. We have seen it function and still see it function within governmentalities that would no doubt fall more under what last year we called the police state. That is to say, a hyper-administrative state in which there is, so to speak, a fusion, a continuity, the constitution of a sort of massive block between governmentality and administration. At that point, in the governmentality of a police state, socialism functions as the internal logic of an administrative apparatus. Maybe there are still other governmentalities that socialism is connected up to. It remains to be seen. But in any case, I do not think that for the moment there is an autonomous governmentality of socialism. Let's consider things from a different angle. When we cross the border separating the Germany of Helmut Schmidt and the Germany of Erich Honecker, the question every good Western intellectual asks himself is, of course, where is true socialism? Is it where I have just come from? Or there where I am going? Is it on the right or the left? On this side or the other? Where is true socialism? But does this question have any meaning? Basically, should we not say instead that socialism is no more true here than there, for the simple reason that socialism does not have to be true? What I mean is that socialism is anyway connected up to a type of governmentality. Here it is connected up to this governmentality, and there it is connected up to another, yielding very dissimilar fruit. in both cases. And in the event, of course, of a more or less normal or aberrant branch, the same deadly fruit. But do we address to liberalism the question, which is already raised within and with regard to socialism, namely, true or false? A form of liberalism does not have to be true or false. One asks whether a form of liberalism is pure, radical, consistent, or mixed, etc. That is to say, we ask what rules it adopts for itself, how it offsets compensating mechanisms, how it calculates the mechanisms of measurement it has installed within its governmentality. I think that if we are so strongly inclined to put to socialism this indiscreet question of truth that we never address to socialism, are you true or are you false? It is precisely because socialism lacks an intrinsic governmental rationality, and because it replaces this essential and still not overcome absence of an internal governmental rationality with the relationship of conformity to a text. The relationship of conformity to a text or to a series of texts is charged with concealing this absence of governmental rationality. A way of reading and interpreting is advanced that must found socialism and indicate the very limits and possibilities of its potential action. Whereas what it really needs is to define for itself its way of doing things and its way of governing. I think the importance of the text in socialism is commensurate with the lacuna constituted by the absence of a socialist art of government. With regard to all forms of real socialism, of every socialism implemented in policy, we should not ask what text it refers to, whether or not it betrays the text, whether or not it conforms to the text, or whether it is true or false. We should simply and always ask socialism, so what is this necessarily extrinsic governmentality that makes you function and only within which you can function? And if this kind of question seems to smell too much of resentment, let us put the question in a more general way and more turned towards the future. What would really be the governmentality of appropriate to socialism? Is there a governmentality appropriate to socialism? What governmentality is possible as a strictly, intrinsically, and autonomously socialist governmentality? In any case, We know only that if there is a really socialist governmentality, then it is not hidden within socialism and its texts. It cannot be deduced from them. It must be invented. This then is the historical framework within which what is called German neoliberalism takes shape. You can see that we are dealing with a whole set of things that it would be impossible to reduce to a pure and simple calculation of political groups or political personnel of Germany after its defeat. Although the existence, pressure, and the possible strategies defined by the situation were absolutely determinate, it is something other than a political calculation, even if it is completely permeated by political calculation. No more is it an ideology, although, of course, there is a whole set of perfectly coherent ideas, analytical principles, and so forth. What is involved, in fact, is a new programming of liberal governmentality. It is an internal reorganization that, once again, does not ask the state what freedom it will leave to the economy, but asks the economy how its freedom can have a state creating function and role, in the sense that it will really make possible the foundation of the state's legitimacy. Okay, again, what is involved in fact is a new programming of liberal governmentality. It is an internal reorganization that, once again, does not ask the state what freedom it will leave to the economy, but asks the economy how its freedom can have a state creating function and role, in the sense that it will really make possible the foundation of the state's legitimacy. I will stop there. So next week, I would like to talk about the formation of this neoliberal doctrine around 1925 and its implementation from around 1952. Okay, that's the end of lecture 4 of the birth of politics.